Imagine standing at the gates of the Forbidden City. Towering red walls, golden roofs that gleam under the sun, and an empire's power pulsing behind locked doors. During the Ming Dynasty, between 1368 and 1644, this wasn't just a palace. It was the beating heart of the world's most powerful empire. Emperors ruled, grand ceremonies dazzled the eyes, and countless secrets lingered in the shadows. But behind the pageantry, hidden deep within those walls, lived a silent army of women, tens of thousands of palace maids. They weren't princesses or queens. Most were ordinary girls, recruited from villages scattered across China. Some came from families who hoped sending a daughter to the palace would bring fortune or honor. Others were chosen simply because the state demanded it. Once inside, their lives changed forever. These young women were trained to serve the emperor, the empress, and the imperial family. They cooked, cleaned, dressed the royals, attended to ceremonies, and guarded treasures. But make no mistake, the palace wasn't a fairy tale world of silk gowns and golden chandeliers. For these maids, it was a gilded prison. They lived under strict rules. They couldn't step beyond the palace gates. They couldn't choose who to love, where to go, or how to live. Every day, they woke up knowing that their futures no longer belonged to them. And yet, this isn't just a story about hardship. It's a story about mystery. Because the Forbidden City holds a chilling secret. Some of these palace maids simply disappeared. No trace, no explanation. One day, they were recorded in the palace registers. The next, their names vanished, as if erased from existence. What happened to them? Were they quietly executed for overhearing a forbidden conversation? Did they become pawns in palace intrigues, crushed by the ruthless struggle for power? Or were they victims of darker secrets? Hidden dungeons, secret passages, and silent punishments no one dared to speak of. Imagine being one of those young women. You've spent years serving the imperial family, walking on polished marble floors, bowing in candlelit halls, and suddenly, you hear whispers of another maid who vanished. She didn't say goodbye. Her bed is empty. Her name is crossed out of the registry. Guards and eunuchs refuse to answer questions. The air feels heavier, colder. And you realize it could happen to you at any time. Now think about this. The Forbidden City wasn't just a palace. It was a fortress sealed off from the outside world. Once a girl entered, she almost never left. Families rarely saw their daughters again. So when these disappearances happened, parents and relatives never received explanations. No letter, no body, no word. Their daughters were swallowed by the palace walls. Some historians argue that these vanishings could be explained by disease or accidents. Tragic, yes, but ordinary. After all, the palace was crowded, and epidemics sometimes swept through the empire. But if it was only sickness, why the silence? Why the missing names? Why the secrecy? Others believe these disappearances were political cover-ups. If a maid overheard a plot against the emperor, or if she became involved in a forbidden affair with a prince or eunuch, her existence might be erased to protect the dynasty's image. And then there are the legends, stories that whisper about hidden chambers beneath the Forbidden City. Secret tunnels where punishments were carried out in darkness. Dungeons where the vanished never returned. We can't prove these tales, but the fact that they survive, centuries later, tells us how deeply these mysteries haunted the Chinese imagination. This is the paradox of the Ming Dynasty's glory. On the outside, it shined with wealth, art, and order, but on the inside, behind the silk screens and golden doors, it carried the weight of fear and silence. For the palace maids, life was not just service, it was survival. So tonight, as we step into this forgotten world, I want you to ask yourself, what price is hidden behind the grandeur of empires? And how many voices, silenced, erased, and lost to history, are buried beneath the stones of the Forbidden City? Because the story of the missing maids is not just about the past. It's about power, secrecy, and the human cost of a system that demanded silence. And it's about us, our endless fascination with mysteries that history tried to erase. Step inside the Forbidden City during the Ming Dynasty, and you'll find yourself surrounded not only by emperors and their consorts, but by an astonishing hidden workforce, tens of thousands of palace women. At its peak, the court employed somewhere between 20,000 to 30,000 maids. Imagine that for a moment, an entire city of young women, living, working, and breathing within the same walls. Most of these women weren't born into privilege. They came from ordinary families, often in small villages scattered across China. Their ages? Usually between 13 and 25 years old, barely more than children when they were taken into service. For some families, sending a daughter to the imperial palace was seen as an honor, even a way to improve their social standing. But for the girls themselves, it was a one-way trip. Once inside the palace gates, there was no going back. Life in the Forbidden City was suffocatingly strict. The moment these girls entered, their personal freedom ended. They were forbidden to leave. They couldn't visit their families. They couldn't wander the streets of Beijing. They couldn't even look beyond the palace walls. The world they had known was replaced by a closed universe of rules, rituals, and endless service. And what did that service look like? It wasn't glamorous, despite what we might picture when we think of royal courts. Palace maids performed every imaginable task. Some swept vast marble floors. Others washed clothing for the imperial family, carried water, or prepared meals. A select few tended to the emperor's wives and concubines, arranging their hair, helping them dress, or carrying out small personal errands. The most trusted were assigned to handle precious documents or ceremonial duties, where even the smallest mistake could bring disaster. But here's the thing. No matter how trivial the job seemed, the rules were absolute. Every move had to follow palace protocol, even the way a maid bowed, the way she spoke, the way she held her hands while waiting. All of it was dictated by custom. And if she slipped? If she disobeyed even in the smallest way, the punishments were terrifying. We're talking about severe consequences for even minor infractions. A wrong word to the wrong person, a garment folded incorrectly, a misstep in the presence of the emperor. Any of these could mean being whipped, imprisoned, or worse. In some cases, the punishment was public, designed to strike fear into the hearts of others. Imagine the weight of that constant pressure. To serve perfectly every single day, knowing that failure wasn't just frowned upon, it could cost you your life. Now, think about the psychology of this environment. Thousands of young women, isolated from their families, forced to live together under constant supervision. Rivalries were inevitable. Friendships were risky. A careless whisper could be reported and twisted into an accusation. And remember, in the Forbidden City, the emperor's word was law. If he, or even one of his consorts, believed a maid was disloyal, there was no defense, no appeal. Her fate was sealed. It's easy to imagine the palace as a beautiful prison, ornate halls, golden ceilings, and polished courtyards masking a deeper reality of fear. Day after day, these women lived on the edge, torn between duty and survival. Let me ask you, what would you do in that situation? If you were 15 years old, taken from your home, trapped behind walls you could never escape, forced to serve under a system where one mistake could end you, would you follow every rule, keep your head down and hope to survive? Or would you risk everything for even a small taste of freedom? For the maids of the Ming harem, that question wasn't hypothetical. It was their daily reality. And the sheer scale of this system, thousands upon thousands of women, all trapped in the same gilded cage, reminds us of the human cost behind the grandeur of empire. The Ming Dynasty may be remembered for its art, its architecture, and its power. But within the Forbidden City, its survival depended on an army of invisible women, women whose names we rarely know, women who lived lives of service, silence, and fear. And as we'll soon see, the risks they faced went far beyond strict rules and hard labor. Because some of them didn't just suffer punishments, they vanished entirely.
Now let's step deeper into the shadows of the Forbidden City, because this is where the story turns truly unsettling. Life inside the Ming harem was already suffocating, but for some palace maids, it didn't just mean endless service or harsh punishments. It meant something far worse. They vanished, and I don't mean they were dismissed. or quietly retired. I mean, they disappeared without a trace. No farewell, no explanation. Just gone. If you flip through the palace registers, those meticulous lists that tracked who lived and worked inside the Forbidden City, you'll notice something strange. In certain years, there are sudden drops in the number of servants. Names simply stop appearing, with no reason provided. What makes this so chilling is how systematic the Ming bureaucracy usually was. Everything from the emperor's meals to the exact duties of every maid was recorded with obsessive detail. So how do you explain a vanishing act in the paperwork? For the families of these girls, the silence was even worse. Imagine being a farmer in a distant village who once watched his daughter walk proudly through the gates of the capital, chosen to serve the Son of Heaven himself. Months pass, years maybe, and then nothing. No letters, no return, no word of her fate. And when the family asks, the answer is silence. No body, no compensation, no acknowledgement that she ever existed. It's as if the palace itself swallowed her whole. So what could have happened to them? The most obvious explanation, and the one whispered about even in the courtyards of Beijing, was execution. The Ming court was a brutal place. Intrigue was everywhere, and a single overheard conversation could determine the fate of kingdoms. Imagine a maid walking into a hall too early, catching a glimpse of the emperor and his advisors plotting a military campaign. Or worse, hearing a conspiracy whispered between rival factions. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't supposed to know. And in a world where secrecy meant survival, the solution was often simple. Erase her. But it wasn't just politics. Some maids were accused of theft, stealing silk, jewelry, or food meant for the imperial household. Others were charged with disrespect, failing to bow deeply enough, speaking at the wrong time, or letting their eyes linger where they shouldn't. In a palace where etiquette was sacred, even the smallest slip could be twisted into a crime. And then, of course, there were the more scandalous rumors. Secret affairs between palace maids and eunuchs, whispered romances with princes or even visiting officials. These weren't just breaches of morality. They were seen as direct threats to the purity and stability of the dynasty. When caught, the punishment wasn't trial or exile. It was disappearance. One day the maid was there. The next, her name vanished from the registry, as though she had never existed. Think about that for a moment. Thousands of women, all living under the same roof, constantly aware that one mistake, or even the perception of a mistake, could mean total erasure. How do you live with that kind of fear? How do you breathe in a world where silence isn't just expected, it's survival? And then, there are the legends. Stories that lingered in whispers long after the Ming Dynasty fell. Some claimed that beneath the Forbidden City lay a labyrinth of hidden tunnels. Not just passageways for guards or secret routes for emperors, but chambers where punishments were carried out, far from public eyes. Dark dungeons where the vanished were taken, never to return. Now, historians debate whether these tunnels really existed or whether they're just products of popular imagination. But the fact that the stories persist tells us something important. People believed the palace had secrets it wasn't willing to share. They imagined chambers of silence where executions could take place without leaving a mark on the official record. Picture it. A maid accused of disloyalty is quietly escorted through a side door at night. Her footsteps echo down a narrow stone passage. The torches burn low, and then nothing. She never comes back. The next morning, her name is scratched from the records, her bed reassigned, her existence erased. It's terrifying, isn't it? Because it's not just about one woman's fate. It's about a system designed to keep everyone in line through fear. Even if you never saw the dungeons yourself, the whispers were enough. Enough to remind you that your life didn't belong to you. It belonged to the palace. What makes these disappearances so haunting isn't just the possibility of secret executions or underground chambers. It's the culture they created. Imagine the paranoia among the remaining maids. One girl's absence becomes a warning for everyone else. Every time someone vanished, the silence screamed louder than any official decree. Obey or be erased. This wasn't just punishment. It was control. And that's what makes the story of these missing maids more than a footnote in history. It reveals the darker side of imperial power, the need to protect the dynasty's image at all costs. even if it meant sacrificing those who served it. And here's the haunting part. We may never know the full truth. Were these disappearances executions? Disease cover-ups? Escapes gone wrong? Or simply clerical errors? The records won't tell us. The Forbidden City guards its secrets well. But maybe the real lesson isn't in solving the mystery, but in what it reveals about human nature. When absolute power is concentrated behind closed doors, those at the bottom often pay the highest price. Their stories are erased, their voices silenced, and yet centuries later we're still asking, what happened to them? So when you walk the halls of the Forbidden City today, surrounded by tourists and camera flashes, remember this. Beneath the polished floors and painted walls lies a history written in silence. A history of young women who entered those gates and never walked out again. And their absence, the holes in the records, the whispers of executions, the legends of dungeons, is perhaps the loudest testimony of all. So, what really happened to the palace maids who vanished behind the walls of the Forbidden City? History gives us hints, legends give us stories, but the truth lies somewhere in between. Let's explore the most compelling explanations and see what they reveal about life in the Ming court. First, the most chilling possibility: political silencing. The Forbidden City was not just a palace, it was the nerve center of an empire. Every whisper, every rivalry, every power struggle carried enormous stakes. A single careless word, overheard by the wrong ears, could spark suspicion. And in this world, suspicion was often a death sentence. Picture this. A young maid is sweeping a corridor late at night. She hears two officials discussing a secret alliance, or perhaps a plot against the emperor. She wasn't meant to hear it, but now she knows too much. What do you do with someone like that? In a system where stability was everything, the answer was simple. You erase her existence. Sometimes these women weren't just unlucky bystanders. They could be scapegoats, sacrificed to cover up the mistakes of powerful people. If an expensive jewel went missing, or a delicate political message leaked outside the palace, blaming a lowly maid was convenient. No investigation, no defense, just disappearance. And think about what that means. These girls became pawns in a game they never chose to play. They were powerless in life, and even more powerless in death. Their names scratched out, their stories erased, all to protect the image of an untouchable dynasty. But not every disappearance may have been political. Some could have been the result of something far more ordinary, and yet equally tragic: disease and famine. We often imagine the Forbidden City as a symbol of endless wealth and luxury. But inside those walls lived tens of thousands of people packed tightly together: servants, guards, eunuchs, concubines, an entire miniature city. And like any crowded city in the pre-modern world, it was vulnerable. Outbreaks of plague, influenza, or smallpox swept through China in waves during the Ming Dynasty. If disease broke out inside the palace, the impact could be devastating. Hundreds of servants might fall ill. Some would recover, but many wouldn't. And here's where it gets complicated. The imperial court valued its image above all else. If word leaked that sickness was rampant inside the emperor's household, it could damage the dynasty's aura of divine protection. So what was the solution? Silence. Deaths were underreported. Names were erased. The illusion of order was maintained, even if reality was chaos. Famine, too, left its scars. During times of drought or rebellion, food supplies sometimes ran dangerously low, even for the palace. Ordinary servants, maids at the very bottom of the hierarchy, were the first to suffer. Malnutrition and starvation could have claimed lives quietly, with records adjusted later to hide the weakness of the empire's heart. It's a sobering thought. Some of the vanished may not have been victims of intrigue, but of hunger and disease, the same forces that haunted ordinary people outside the palace. The difference? Their deaths had to be concealed, because the emperor's household was supposed to be untouchable. And then, there's the most daring possibility of all: escape. There are scattered stories, half legend, half rumor, that some palace maids attempted to flee. Life inside was so stifling, so unbearable, that a handful risked everything for a chance at freedom. Sometimes sympathetic eunuchs might help, smuggling them through hidden doors or disguising them as traitors or servants of officials. But let's be honest, Survival outside was almost impossible. These women had no money, no family connections they could safely return to, and no freedom papers. If caught, the punishment was brutal. And even if they escaped the city, where could they go? Who would shelter them, knowing the wrath of the emperor could fall on anyone who harbored a runaway? Still, the fact that escape stories exist at all tells us something powerful. Not every disappearance was forced. Some women may have chosen to risk death rather than endure a lifetime of silence and servitude. And that, in itself, is a testament to human resilience. The courage to seek freedom, even against impossible odds. So which explanation is correct? Political cover-ups? Disease and famine? Escape? The answer might be all of them. The Forbidden City was a world of contradictions, opulence and misery, order and secrecy, beauty and brutality. Every missing maid's story may have been different. Some silenced for what they knew, some lost to sickness, some brave enough to run. But taken together, these disappearances remind us of the cost of absolute power. When an empire is built on silence, those at the bottom disappear first. And maybe that's the real mystery. Not just how they vanished, but why we're still asking about them centuries later. Because deep down we know these women mattered. Their lives and their losses are threads in the fabric of history. Threads the dynasty tried to cut, but could never fully erase. Now, imagine living every single day with a shadow hanging over you, knowing that no matter how hard you worked, no matter how perfectly you followed the rules, you could simply vanish overnight. That was the daily reality for the palace maids of the Ming Dynasty. Inside the Forbidden City, life was not just strict, it was terrifying. Every young woman who served there understood one thing: she had no control over her own fate. A misplaced word, a glance at the wrong person, even being in the wrong corridor at the wrong time, could mean the end. And there would be no trial, no defense, no explanation. You would just disappear. Think about what that does to the human mind. Living with that kind of fear isn't just exhausting. It reshapes the way you see the world. Trust becomes a luxury you can't afford. Friendships, if they existed at all, were fragile and dangerous, because in a world where silence was survival, betrayal was often the easiest way to stay alive. Stories whisper of maids who turned on each other, not out of cruelty, but out of desperation. A jealous rival might report another girl for breaking a rule, knowing that such an accusation could erase her from the palace forever. Eunuchs, too, were part of this game, sometimes protectors, sometimes manipulators. Alliances shifted like sand, and loyalty was never guaranteed. Can you imagine the atmosphere this created? Hundreds, even thousands, of young women, all living together, yet unable to truly trust one another. Every smile might hide suspicion. Every whispered conversation might be a trap. Fear wasn't just a background feeling. It was the very air they breathed. And this brings us to the heart of the matter: the human cost of imperial power. On the outside, the Forbidden City dazzled with its golden roofs and marble halls. It was the symbol of Ming Dynasty glory, a world of wealth and authority. But for the women inside, it was nothing less than a prison wrapped in silk. Yes, they lived among riches. They wore fine fabrics, served exquisite meals, and walked halls built to awe the world. But those luxuries were never theirs. They didn't belong to the maids. They belonged to the emperor, to the dynasty. For the girls who served, life was not about choice, but about survival. Think of the irony. They were prisoners of luxury. Surrounded by beauty, but cut off from freedom. Surrounded by people, but isolated in fear. And most devastating of all, their lives could be erased in silence, leaving no memory behind. This is where history becomes more than just facts and numbers. Because behind every missing name in a register, behind every unmarked disappearance, was a real person. A young girl with a family who once held her, laughed with her, dreamed for her. A human being whose story ended not with recognition, but with silence. And here's the haunting part. The system was designed that way. The fear, the betrayals, the vanishing acts, they weren't accidents. They were part of the machinery of imperial control. The palace didn't need to remind these women of their powerlessness. The silence of the disappeared did that job all too well. So, when we look back at the Ming Dynasty, it's easy to be dazzled by the art, the architecture, the sheer scale of the empire. But if we want to understand the truth, we have to look at what it cost. Because the glory of the Forbidden City was built not only on gold and power, but on the lives of countless women whose names history tried to erase. And maybe that's the greatest tragedy. Not just that they lived in fear, but that for centuries their voices were silenced. Their stories lost, their humanity reduced to footnotes in dusty records. Yet, in speaking of them today, in remembering their struggle, we give them something the empire denied them: acknowledgement. A chance, however small, to be seen not as shadows but as people. As we reach the end of this journey through the Forbidden City, let's pause and reflect. We've walked the marble halls, peeked into the shadowed chambers, and uncovered the whispers of young women who lived, and sometimes vanished, behind those golden walls. On the surface, the Ming Dynasty shines as one of China's greatest eras. Its emperors commanded vast armies. Its palaces symbolized wealth and power that stunned the world. But peel back the silk curtains, and you find a darker truth. Thousands of palace maids, brought in as children, lived in fear, isolation, and silence. Some disappeared because of politics, silenced for what they knew. Some were erased by disease or famine, their deaths hidden to protect the dynasty's image. And some perhaps risked the unthinkable, escape. Each story different, each one lost in shadows. And yet together, their absence forms a pattern too powerful to ignore. It tells us something about the cost of empires, about the way absolute power not only builds monuments but also buries lives. Think about this. These young women weren't queens or rulers. They weren't celebrated in paintings or remembered in chronicles. They were ordinary girls, swept into an extraordinary world where their humanity was often treated as expendable. And history almost forgot them. Almost. But here's the irony. Centuries later, it's not just the emperors or generals who capture our imagination. It's them. The missing maids, the women who lived in silence, but left behind questions that echo louder than any official decree. When you stand inside the Forbidden City today, surrounded by tourists and sunlight, it's easy to marvel at the grandeur. But if you listen closely, really listen, you might feel something else. A quiet presence. A reminder that beneath the polished floors within those endless courtyards are stories untold. Stories of fear, of resilience, of humanity caught in the gears of power. Stories that were never supposed to survive, but somehow still do. Carried in whispers, in legends, and in the gaps left behind in history's records. And maybe that's why we're drawn to mysteries like this. Because they remind us of something universal. Power can silence voices, but it can never fully erase them. Memory has a way of enduring. Questions have a way of surviving. And the very act of asking, what happened to them, is a way of keeping them alive. So the next time you think of the Ming Dynasty, don't just picture emperors in golden robes or ceremonies beneath vast red gates. Picture the unseen. The girls whose names were crossed out, whose families never saw them again, whose lives were lived in the shadows. Because history is not just the story of rulers. It's the story of those who served, who suffered, and who were silenced. And in remembering them, we reclaim a piece of humanity that the empire tried to erase. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the vanished maids of the Ming harem. Not just a haunting mystery, but a mirror that forces us to ask, how many voices in our own time are being silenced? How many lives are hidden behind the walls of power today? The Forbidden City still stands, its golden roofs glittering in the sunlight. But within those walls lingers a silence that speaks volumes, a silence we cannot ignore. And so, the mystery remains, unsolved, unanswered, unforgettable.